Teres, Allingham with the Virtual Weber Gas Grill. Today, let's talk about slicing meat across the grain. Now this is a video for people who are just starting out in learning how to grill and barbecue. If you're an experienced griller or barbecuer, or you're an intermediate skilled level griller or barbecuer, you probably already know all the things you're going to see in this video. So you can feel free to stay tuned and watch, or you can move on to another one of my videos. But I am creating this specifically for people who are brand new to the hobby of grilling and barbecuing, and they may not know what it means to slice meat across the grain. For the last year, every time I've cooked a different piece of meat, I have taken some photos or shot some video and showed what it means to cut that piece of meat across the grain. And I want to go through those with you today. So what are we talking about when we talk about the grain of meat? Well, meat is made of muscle, and muscle is made of muscle fibers. And muscle fibers tend to arrange themselves in a particular direction, an orientation. And that's what we are referring to when we talk about the grain of the meat. Kind of like if you've ever looked at a board, you know that wood has a grain to it, a direction in which the wood fibers grow and orient themselves. Well, it's very similar in a piece of meat. There's a direction to it, and that's what we refer to as the grain. Now, I have here a box of straws. We could pretend that this box of straws is a block of meat. And if we were to get out our microscope and look inside, we could see that it's made up of a whole bunch of fibers that are oriented in a particular direction. Not as neatly as these straws are, but there's an orientation to it. And if we were to take a knife and slice in this direction across all of these long pieces into little short pieces, that's cutting the meat across the grain. The reason that we cut meat across the grain is that it makes it eat in a more tender way for us. You know, meat is what it is. It's going to be naturally tender or not, but the way we cut it can enhance the tenderness that we feel in our mouth. So let's consider for a moment this piece of beef jerky. We've all eaten beef jerky. We all know that it's cut with the grain. So it's a thin sheet of meat that's cut with the grain. And you can see the grain of the meat here. It's running from top to bottom in the way I'm holding it. It's very tough. You know, if I grab it and I try to break it by pulling across its length, I could do this all day long and I wouldn't be able to break it apart. But if I take a pair of scissors and I cut this jerky across the grain in a small piece here, and I now pull it across the grain, it breaks apart very easily. And that's because the bonds that hold this meat together in this orientation are much easier to break than they are when the meat is pulled in this orientation. So this is the whole concept of slicing meat across the grain. We're able to break it up into smaller little pieces that are easier for us to break apart when we chew, and that gives us a sensation of tenderness. So let's get right into it with our first cut of meat. This is a flank steak. Flank steak is very often marinated and grilled, or it's rubbed and grilled. Sometimes we put it in a taco or in a sandwich, but more often than not, we just slice it and we eat it on the plate with some sides. Now, I think you can tell without too much education that this grain is very obvious in this piece of meat. And I will highlight it here with some lines, and you can see that the grain of this meat is running from left to right, but it's not running exactly parallel. For this particular piece of meat, it sort of gets more narrow on the right side than it is on the left side. Here's a piece of grilled flank steak that I'm slicing on the cutting board, and you can see here that I am slicing it on that wider end. It's basically flipped 180 degrees. The narrow side is now on the left and the wider side's on the right, and I'm slicing it across the grain, across the direction of that meat that was running left to right. Now I'm also holding the knife at an angle, about a 45-degree angle. This is known as slicing on the bias. And when you turn the knife like that toward one side or the other, that also enhances the tenderness of the meat. It just is a different way of cutting through those meat fibers, and it makes it a little bit more tender in the way it eats. And here's a glamour shot of the sliced flank steak sliced across the grain. Absolutely delicious and properly sliced across the grain to maximize its tenderness. Our next cut of meat is skirt steak. Skirt steak has a very pronounced grain to it. This is actually 2 pieces of skirt steak that I've cut into half to make it easier to handle on the grill. And in the close-up view, you can see I'm pointing out the direction of the grain. Unlike the flank steak where it was running left to right, in a skirt steak, the grain is running up and down vertically. And I'll highlight that with some lines here so you can see the orientation. And you can see that again, the grain of the meat is not always perfectly up and down. It does tend to wander a little bit. That's just the nature of how meat is put together. And here's a photo of my finished grilled skirt steak that I have marinated in teriyaki glaze, which I really like a lot. It's one of our favorites. And now you can see the finished skirt steak. I've turned it so that it's long ways up and down. The grain is now running left to right, and I'm cutting it across the grain with a sharp knife. I'm not cutting it on the bias. You certainly could do that. In fact, here I'm doing it, just turning that knife 45 degrees. This is a very common cut of meat that you'd use for fajitas, for example. And it's very chewy by nature, but it eats a little bit better and a little bit more tender when you cut it across the grain, as shown here. Our third cut of meat is tri-tip, and boy, is it a good cut of meat. It used to be a West Coast phenomenon. You had a hard time finding it in other parts of the United States, but I think today you find it fresh, as you see here, at many Costco's and Sam's Clubs around the country. And you can find marinated versions oftentimes at Costco or at Trader Joe's and other stores around the United States. It's a roast, and as you can see here, it has a distinctive grain to it that uniquely runs in two different directions. And I'm going to strike a red line across the point where there's a transition between the two different directions of the grain. And above this red line, you see how the grain is running in this piece on the left. It's running from sort of lower left to upper right. But below that red line, it's running almost straight up and down. And this can vary from cut to cut. I mean, you see here two different tri-tips of two different sizes from two different cows. And the direction of the grain can be more pronounced sometimes in certain pieces of tri-tip than others. On this piece on the right, we'll strike the red line again to show the definition of the two portions of the roast. And above that red line, you see the direction of the grain. And below the red line, you see that it's running in a slightly different direction. And this is important because we do want to slice meat across the grain. And if you were to simply pick a direction and start to cut, the grain would begin to wander away from your knife in a different direction, and you won't get the optimal slice across the grain. So here's a cooked tri-tip, just taking it off the grill. And this is an example of a tri-tip where the difference in direction of the grain is not so pronounced in this particular cut and after it's been cooked. And I'll strike some lines across this so you can see the grain. It is almost the same across the entire width of this piece of meat. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to identify that seam, that transition point between the two directions of the grain, and I'm going to slice the tri-tip into two halves at that point. And then I'll take the longer, narrower piece and I will turn it and I will slice it across the grain, as you can see here. Then I'll take the other half and turn it so that, again, the grain is running left to right as I'm slicing, and I'll slice it across the grain. You end up with two different sizes of slice, two different shapes from each of these halves of a tri-tip. This next cut of meat is called Teres Major, T-E-R-E-S M-A-J-O-R. Something you've probably not seen at the supermarket unless you're shopping at a high-end supermarket, or perhaps you've ordered one from an online butcher. It comes from the chuck primal, the shoulder of the cow. The butcher has to dig it out and fabricate it, clean it up, so that it presents as you see here in this photo. It doesn't weigh very much. It weighs maybe 8 ounces to not much more than 1 pound. So It begs the question, is this a steak or is this a roast? It depends on the size and it depends on who's selling it. You can call it whatever you like, but if you have a larger one, it is something you can slice and share. You can see that Teres Major has a distinctive grain in this photo as we're running from left to right. There's a little bit of a turn at one end of the muscle, but that doesn't present much of an issue in terms of slicing across the grain. And here's a cooked Teres Major, just taking it off the grill, and I'm going to cut some vertical slices across the grain. And then I'm going to switch the orientation of my knife blade and turn it 45 degrees to the left, and we'll do some slices on the bias. So again, cutting across the grain and on the bias is a way of making this cut of meat, which is already a very tender cut of meat. It eats a lot like a tenderloin, actually. It makes it eat even more tender when sliced on the bias. This next cut of meat is pork tenderloin, the only cut of pork that I'll be featuring in this video. It's a long cylindrical muscle, and the muscle fibers run from end to end, from left to right. Pork tenderloin is extremely tender by its nature, and you do want to cut it across the grain to maximize tenderness, but you can cut it at an angle, you can do lots of things with it, and it will still be quite tender. Here you see me cutting some pieces straight across, and then I will turn my knife 45 degrees and do some slicing on the bias. But it's kind of hard to screw up pork tenderloin because it's the nature of tenderloin that it is really tender, and you don't have to be particularly precise in how you cut it. Our next steak is the flat iron steak. As you can see, flat iron steak has a very pronounced grain to it, running from left to right in this photo, and there's a lot of intermuscular fat in the flat iron steak. Flat iron is another example of a steak that's fabricated from the shoulder of the cow. It was identified in 2002 as a new retail cut by the National Cattlemen's Beef Association in partnership with the University of Nebraska and the University of Florida. They were trying to figure out how to find a low price cut that could be trimmed into steaks and roasts that would be flavorful and tender and could be sold at a lower price than other popular cuts. And they found this muscle in the shoulder. They extract it and clean it up, and it presents as a steak, as you see in this photo. I cut the flat iron into two pieces and grilled them separately. Here you see half of it, and the grain orientation is running left to right, and I'm slicing across the grain. The next steak is Filet Mignon. This is cut from the beef tenderloin. And we're now getting into a series of steaks where it really doesn't matter a whole lot which way you cut it on the plate because it has already been cut across the grain for you by the butcher. Here's a photo of a whole beef tenderloin at Costco. I'll put some lines on it to show how it would be cut into steaks. It's very similar to what we did with the pork tenderloin earlier in the video. A long slender piece of meat that we cut across the narrow dimension to render thin slices. In the case of beef tenderloin, it's cut into a thicker slice, the grain running from left to right lengthwise in this large roast, but then it's cut across the grain into steaks. So when we look at the steak sitting on the plate, we're looking basically at the end grain facing up on the face of the steak. The grain is running from bottom to top, from the surface of the plate up toward the top surface of the meat that we see here. Now when we cut into the filet mignon on the plate, it really doesn't matter which direction we cut into it. Left to right, top to bottom, at an angle, it eats very tender no matter how you cut it. Our next steak is the New York strip steak. It's the next door neighbor to the filet mignon. If you've ever had a T-bone steak, or better yet, a porterhouse steak, on one side of the bone, you have the tender filet, and on the other side of the bone, you have the strip steak. Here's an example of a whole beef loin from which New York steaks are cut from Costco. And I'll put some lines across this picture so you can see how the steaks are cut. The grain is running from left to right in this large cut of meat. It does wander a bit back and forth, but it is generally left to right. And so steaks are cut across the grain, across the narrow dimension of this large piece of meat. Now, when it comes to slicing a cooked New York steak, you're generally going to slice it across the narrow dimension, and that results in slices that are generally cut across the grain. As I mentioned, the grain tends to wander a bit in New York steak, so you don't have to be terribly precise because the New York strip is a pretty tender cut of meat anyway, so you don't have to be perfect. I have seen instances, though, where chefs will cut this piece in half across its width, and then they will turn it 90 degrees and then cut slices, as I'm doing here. I'm not always sure why they do that. It may not exactly be across the grain, or it may be across the grain depending upon how that grain is wandering in the piece of meat. My personal opinion is you can't really go wrong by simply cutting slices across the narrow dimension of a New York strip steak. Next up is the fabulous ribeye steak, probably my favorite steak, and favorite steak of many people because of its intermuscular fat and tenderness. It's just a fabulous steak. It comes from the rib roast, sometimes known as the prime rib roast. You see a rib roast here from Costco, and I'll put some lines to show how it's cut into steaks. It is cut across the narrow dimension. Now, this looks like a square block of meat, but actually this is about half of a rib roast. So if you imagine this being twice as long from left to right, the narrow dimension would be the cutting from top to bottom as seen in this picture. It's naturally a very tender cut of meat, and in general, the muscle fibers are running from left to right through this cut of meat. And here I'm demonstrating how these two ribeye steaks would have been joined together as part of a larger rib roast. Now, if you're slicing a large ribeye steak to share it with someone else, I would cut it across the narrow dimension. However, if you're eating it for yourself on the plate, I really don't think it matters much in what orientation you slice it. It's a very tender cut of meat, and you will enjoy it no matter how you slice it. This next steak is a sirloin steak, and unfortunately you're going to have to watch me eat it on the plate. It comes from the sirloin portion of the cow, which is the next to the last section at the back end of the cow, right in front of the round or the rump area. It is a less tender cut of meat. The grain tends to wander quite a bit. I'm not cutting it precisely across the grain here. If I turn my knife about 45 degrees to the left, I would be, but in this steak, I'm not too particular about it, and I'm just cutting it across the narrow dimension of the steak. Now, shifting to a different species, let's consider chicken breast, boneless, skinless chicken breast. At first glance, a chicken breast doesn't seem to have a grain, but in fact it does. And if you cook one and you take it in your fingers and you bend it, you'll see it will crack along the dimensions of the grain. So knowing that direction, you can now slice across that grain and get a nice tender slice. It's not that it will not be tender if you cut it with the grain, but it will be somewhat more tender and will eat better if you slice it across the grain. And you'll have nice slices for a salad or for a sandwich or for fettuccine alfredo or some other purpose. Now let's quickly consider sausage. It's kind of funny to include sausage in a video like this because sausage is made up of ground meat, and ground meat does not have a grain to it. The only reason I'm showing it to you is I wanted to demonstrate how to cut it either in straight up and down slices or to cut it on the bias, which gives you a nicer presentation, a more interesting looking piece of sausage. Very common to see sausage sliced this way, and it gives you a slightly larger surface area, just a different way of slicing it, but it does not in any way affect the tenderness of the sausage. And last, our final meat is brisket. This is not a grilled meat, it is a barbecued meat, but I'm going to include it here because it is one of the meats that is so easy to mess up. You will not get poorly sliced brisket if you go to a really high quality barbecue joint, But if you go to some lesser ones, you will find brisket cut in the wrong orientation, and it really is messed up when that happens. This is a photo of some sliced brisket flat, and it is perfectly sliced across the grain. We're not going to talk about, or not going to demonstrate visually slicing the point. It's a subject for another day perhaps. I will include a link in the description of this video to a written description of how you can turn the point portion of the brisket in order to slice it. It's called the Texas turn. You can look that up on your own time, and I don't have any video of it. But here what I want to show you is just how badly messed up a piece of brisket is if you cut it with the grain versus against the grain. Now what I have here is a chunk of cold brisket. This was in the refrigerator, and I'm pointing out with the knife the direction of the grain. It's very, very obvious. You want to slice this meat against the grain, but what I'm going to do here is I'm going to mess it up. I'm going to open up the brisket with the grain, and then I'm going to use my knife, and I'm just going to, like a guillotine, just go straight down through this cold meat and extract a slice that is cut with the grain. And now similarly, I'm going to turn my knife 90 degrees, and I'm going to cut down like a guillotine across the grain to get a slice that is properly sliced across the grain. And here's those two slices side by side. You can just see the difference. The piece sliced with the grain is ropey and stringy, and if you cut a piece of that and put it in your mouth and chew on it, you will be able to do so. It's not impossible, but it does not eat as nicely and as tenderly as the piece has been cut across the grain. So with the brisket flat, it's really important to slice the meat across the grain. Okay, a couple of final things. This knife that you see me using throughout the video, this is my favorite slicing knife. It's not a very expensive knife. This is the Dexter SanaSafe S140-12SC. I'll put a link to it in the description of the video. You can get it on Amazon. I don't know what it costs anymore since the cost of everything is so crazy. Sometimes they're out of stock. The reason that they are sometimes out of stock is because I promote the heck out of this knife, because this is the knife that Aaron Franklin says that he uses at Franklin Barbecue to slice all of his briskets. It's not a fancy knife. It's just a food service knife, but it has an incredibly, incredibly sharp serrated edge, and you don't have to worry too much about treating it with love and tenderness and kindness, because it just is a workhorse, and if you ruin it, you can just get another one for not too much money. So unlike fancy slicing knives that people have, this one gets the job done, and it is wicked sharp. So you might consider this if you're interested in a good knife for slicing brisket. It's big enough to slice brisket, but you also seen all the other things that I used it to slice in this video. The other knife you saw me using in the video to slice is this Wüsthof slicing knife. It's not really a chef's knife. I don't know how they classify it. It's not very big, maybe 8 inches long. Nothing fancy here at all. Nothing really to recommend. The thing to recommend to you is to have a good sharp knife for any of the slicing that you're going to do for your grilling and barbecuing. And the last thing about equipment is this cutting board that you saw me using. This is an OXO 21-inch cutting board with a gravy groove around the edge, and it's a big guy. It does a good job for large cuts of meat. You might lose a small cut of meat on something this big. Just kidding. It does a great job. It cleans up easily. It technically will fit in the dishwasher, I suppose, but I don't use it that way. I clean it by hand. You can see that really sharp Dexter knife does put cut marks into this board. There's no way around it. It's just the way it is. So you have to be willing to accept some of that when you use a super sharp knife like that Dexter knife. Now, I also want to say a word about some of the meat terminology I threw out there, and I tried to direct you to which part of the cow some of these cuts come from. This wasn't a video about cuts of meat and where they come from, but I do have a page on my sister website, the Virtual Weber Bullet, that's loaded with meat charts, and I will put a link to that in the description of this video. And if you want to educate yourself about the primal cuts, the primal sections, the subprimal sections, and where each cut of meat comes from that I talked about today, you can download a myriad of charts in PDF format that you can enjoy and look at and educate yourself about cuts of meat. And lastly, I just want to clarify that you saw me cutting meat in two different ways in this video. Sometimes I cut it straight up and down. Sometimes I cut it on the bias. And I was cutting it straight up and down first and on the bias second. There's no rhyme or reason to that. That's not my process. In other words, I don't always cut meat straight up and down first and then I go to the bias. I was just demonstrating for you the two different ways of cutting meat across the grain. If you want to cut your meat straight up and down across the grain, you can do that. If you want to cut it at the bias, on the bias, you can do that too. But there was no rule that I was trying to demonstrate to you about how to slice meat by doing one before the other. I tend to, if I remember, I tend to try to slice meat on the bias because I think it does make meat eat a little bit more tender. But oftentimes if I'm in a hurry for dinner and I'm not paying much attention, I just cut it straight up and down, as you saw me doing in some of these videos. Well, that's all I have for you today. I hope that you found this video useful and educational, and that helps you understand the importance of slicing meat across the grain and how to do it with various cuts of meat, and which cuts of meat it doesn't really matter for. So you can focus your attention on those where it really does make a difference. I want to thank you for watching. I appreciate you very much. If you please like and subscribe to my videos, it does help other people find them on YouTube amongst the vast array of videos that are out there in the barbecue and grilling area. I really would appreciate it if you could do that for me. And until next time, take care everybody. Hope you're having a great day. Bye-bye.